up here who also was collaborating in this project and programmed this simulation, which is basically the same simulation that he did with Claude, modified a bit to reflect also the simulation that showed you from our lab. But this serial simulation of trajectory control or predictive or optimal control, followed by what we call impedance control or positional specification. And so you can see here a control subject and left hand and right hand, and while there are slight differences, more curved movement here, straighter here, the difference is that these speeds are much lower. This is without vision, and this is what GL does. And you can see that these movements with the left hand go out toward the target, and she does vary the direction with target, as we've seen previously with diaphragmatic patients with the right hand. But then there's this oscillation at the end of target of the movement that looks a lot sort of like an underdamped spring system that just oscillates at the end point with its average position really not far from the target. And the right hand does something way different. It goes out and then it drifts, and this is something that was well known. I mean, we saw this with Rothrell's work on deafferentation, on Sain's work on deafferentation, Claude Guez's work on deafferentation. When you go out to a target and you have your eyes closed and you stop, there tends to be a slow drift when you have deafferentation. And now we see that's true for the right hand, but not so much for the left hand. These are planar movements, by the way. And so these differences are very big, where the non-dominant arm goes out. Oh, I should say, I shouldn't be saying right and left here because Jeanette is left hand dominant. The non-dominant arm goes out and oscillates, and the dominant hand goes out and then drifts. And so Shani and Bob used a very similar simulation to what I showed you previously, a serial simulation that they modified some parameters a bit to reflect these movements. And what they did was a very early switch to the positional controller with high stiffness and low damping, and they get this movement that has not so good initial direction and then oscillates around the specified endpoint, and another one which has a low stiffness or a poorly specified positional controller, low stiffness, low damping, and switch to that late in the movement. And so you get this more accurate initial direction, in this case, in our simulation, completely accurate, with this momentum-induced drift at the end of movement because of the poor postural controller that's initiated late. And so if we look at the real movements compared to the simulated movements, there is, a striking resemblance, which doesn't mean that it's this simple, but it means maybe something like this is going on. Maybe proprioception is really important to specify the switch in these controllers, and without that signal, the controller from the contralateral hemisphere is dominating the movements. And so that's what we think is going on there. So we have this model where we think that we have a dominant system that's specifying something along the lines of efficient control through something that might look like optimal control with solved objective function, and then another controller that's robust and specifies stability and position and something like apparent viscosity that has robustness to it and can deal with unpredictable conditions well, and can specify stability at the end of a reaching movement well. These are the people that we've worked with. These are the funding organizations that has helped us all the way through. And now I'm ready for your questions.
Can I jump right into questions?
Yeah.
From Gregor?
Hey, Gregor.
Yeah, thanks. It's very good to hear this. Part of this I've heard before, and finally I think I understand it. I want to talk about a conceptual issue. I have the impression that in the conceptual way how you talk about these two aspects, the predictive versus impedance, that you're shifting level a little bit. So optimal control is actually really planning. It's a method of planning. It just has that name, right, of optimal control. In other words, the plan generated by optimal control mechanisms needs usually to be still controlled. And physically control means bringing about the physical state, bringing about the action with an actuator. And for instance, in a robot, that's done by a servo controller. It's very stiff in robots. And that's the question of what that is in the nervous system. So in other words, the nervous system doesn't take a torque. You can't take a torque signal and bring that about. You need a controller to bring about the physical state, which we know is probably the peripheral reflex stuff. So what I think the account that you make for the dominant hand is that it is, gets a temporally well-defined command, which would be that optimal controller's output, and then it has some way of bringing that about, which is probably the peripheral reflex story that we know does that. The question then is, what is the other side of that, the impedance side of that? Because for impedance is an analogous thing. So you need to have maybe a plan for impedance as a way to react to perturbations or whatever is by updating some parameters. And then you also need to bring that physically about to make the stiffness or the viscosity. And again, for the stiffness and viscosity, I think you have hinted that modulating that certain reflex loops can bring that about. Yeah. And I think what you're actually talking about as that competence of the non-dominant hand, that's something like the updating of that, the flexible updating of them. That's less clear for impedance because both seem to be of the same nature. I mean, the physical.
So I guess, So let me give you my view on this. So let's go to what I'm saying is the optimal control, right?
Well, so first, maybe you can stop sharing the screen at this moment so we can see each other better.
Oh, okay.
Then you can restart it at any time.
Stop share. Is that better?
Yes.
Oh, it's worse. Now I can see you. All right. So first, let's go with the optimal controller. So I kind of agree with you. Yeah, I think that you have to filter the actuation through the spinal, neuromechanical, neuromusculoskeletal system. Absolutely. Now, what exactly that means in actuation, I'm not so bold as to say that I know what the signal is. I don't reject the idea that there is proportional control of EMG. I don't think that that's the whole picture. I certainly think that reflex mechanisms contribute. Whatever the actuation is at the other end, of course, you can come up with whatever plan you have, as you said, and you can filter it through that actuation mechanism. So I agree with that. So the other mechanism, well, I really think of Prohaska's work in terms of impedance control. So on the one hand, there is something that needs to be specified, if you will, like you said, a plan. And so I should back up a minute. So I don't think either of these things is purely feed forward or purely feedback. And feed forward mechanisms have to be informed by feedback anyhow. But what I mean by not purely feed forward or purely feedback is that I think that you can instantiate control of your trajectory, and you can change your, if you will, your mind or your plan as you're going. And you can respond to unanticipated events when you're going. Lots of things can happen, and that might happen in a way that involves modulating, spinal systems that have been that have been recruited for the particular plan that you have. and continuously recruited. So an example is, some studies that we did where we looked at, we perturbed the arm with a robot arm, and we did it when we popped the position of a target suddenly to different places, and it was single joint movement. And what happened was you modulated the amplitude of the stretch reflex within 100 milliseconds, because we didn't change it graded, so I don't know how quick it was, in accord with wherever you pop the target to. So it's clear that these feed-forward mechanisms that specify, actions, whatever your action is, are going to modulate spinal systems in accord with that. So I agree with that. Now the other system, I think that the concept I have is that the controller that's specifying this plan, if you will, is adapted very well for dealing with predictable aspects of mechanics and other features of the environment, like sensory features of the environment. So I think of it as a model, like you have a model of what your body and the world is going to behave like in advance. You're more tricked by changes in that model. It's not that you don't respond to it. And so I think that, you have circuits that are specialized for these kinds of specifications, carrying out a plan in accord with expectations. And then you have this other system that's basically throws expectations to the wind and specifies positions. And the reason I say impedance is because of apparent viscosity, and which I think is really important. And I don't know why we have gamma dynamics if it's not important. We have the ability to actually modulate, gamma dynamics versus gamma statics, or spring versus dashpot. And so that system I think of as being, maybe you could think of it as a cruder system, but it's a robust system. I want to go somewhere, I'm just going to specify where I am. It's like the Tamar Flash early model of equilibrium point control. I don't really care how I get there. And or a more advanced, sequential model of equilibrium control, in which you have positions that you're specifying along the way with stiffnesses and, if you will, viscosities, I think is important, so that you can even on the way be robust to changes. I don't know. But I think the two can be different. And I think there's evidence that actually you generalize, after you learn a final position, you generalize that differently than you generalize the trajectory, which is Bob and Claude's work. And I also think that there's evidence from Ted Milner's lab and our lab that you can modulate impedance along a trajectory and in a position in surprising ways that, if you will, violate what you would think of as a natural impedance of the arm through neural commands.
Yeah, I think there's a longer discussion to have about that, but maybe not on here in this medium. I think this can be pushed further. This clarification can be pushed further, and I think we probably would converge when we do that. But maybe let's keep it.
That'd be great. I'd love to talk to you more about it.
Right. So let's do Richard, and then Marco, and then the other Richard. Now, Richard van Emmerik, you were first.
So let's call them both mechanisms. But Bob, how stable are these over time? Obviously, in your work you showed repeated trials, but let's say we're going to do this over time for longer periods of time. Would these change?
Would the specializations change?
The specialization in this case between left and right.
So like I said, one of the more perplexing things about handedness to me is how stable it is and how difficult it is for people to switch handedness, if you will. And so when people want to switch handedness, it's not so difficult to learn a new task. So if you want to, when I was in college, I broke my dominant arm, It was casted. We didn't have electronics to take notes on. So I learned to write with my non-dominant hand. I did it pretty well. I can still do it pretty well. Not as well as my dominant hand. But, to me, like I said, there's pretty good evidence that when you do that, when you try and switch dominance, that what you're doing is recruiting the ipsilateral hemisphere with your non-dominant hand versus, re-establishing some new controller, feature in your dominant hemisphere. And the evidence for that comes from Scott Fry's lab, where they looked in a number of studies at people who had lost a dominant hand due to amputation. And they looked at them, on average about 5 years down the line. They didn't have therapy or anything to switch dominance, but some of them got some kind of prosthetic, but the prosthetic really couldn't handle the dominant limb function. So they had to functionally switch dominance. And when Scott and his at the time postdoc, who's might even be listening here, Ben Phillip, when they went and looked at the functional imaging during tracing and drawing tasks with a non-dominant arm, they found substantial recruitment of ipsilateral hemisphere compared to using the non-dominant hand in age-matched controls. So I think that handedness is pretty resistant to change, at least after some developmental age. I think these specializations in the brain are probably pretty stable, but our ability to recruit ipsilateral hemisphere so that we can make one hand look more like the other hand in its specialization, I think is susceptible to training. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, exactly.
Hi, Bob. Thanks for your talk. I have a quick question or comment about armness versus handedness. The literature I'm familiar with discuss, that you talked about at the beginning, tend to focus mostly on what we do with the fingers and the hand, even though, of course, forearm and shoulder muscles support, finger motion, etc. So, given the mechanical differences between the arm and the hands, I wonder. I know this is an old thing that we discussed a few years ago at Penn State as a potential collaboration. We'll get to it one day. But, I wonder how much of that specialization that you discussed spills over to hand muscles. And in particular, when it comes to dexterous movements, where, you can still see, even if you block the arm, if you want to come out with an absurd example, you can still imagine finger muscles being involved to do more stable, stabilizing kind of action versus, more dynamic kind of tasks. So do you have any sense, I don't know if you have any data, but do you have any sense about the extent to which, another absurd example, that level of specialization kind of stops at the wrist, and then because of different descending pathway and functions and mechanics, you may see a completely different story when it comes to the fingers?
Well, we just published a paper looking at very simple wrist movements and saw massive differences. So, but we're looking at different features, because when you get down to the wrist, like when we were looking at, as upper arm, forearm movements and intersegmental dynamics, in these long segments become the big thing that you have to coordinate with if you want to specify something. And, at the wrist, what we did was radial ulnar deviation, which actually, if you do this, you'll find it's hard to isolate in your non-dominant hand, even though you don't do this every day. Your non-dominant hand has a problem. And the reason is because you've got these, especially the carpi muscles, which have multiple axes, multiple moment arms in flexion, extension, and in radial ulnar deviation. And you have to coordinate them precisely so that, if you want to make a planar movement versus bleeding into flexion extension. And this even becomes more of a problem because the more you flex, your flexor carpi muscles actually become more flexors the more you're flexed. So it's a mechanical positive feedback loop. So, we showed these massive differences between, the proficiency for doing this with the dominant and non-dominant arm. But this isn't intersegmental dynamics, it's intermuscular dynamics. I think that intuitively, I'd say the things that I feel most handed about isn't reaching, it's manipulation. And I don't believe that science, done right to look at this is going to violate that intuition. So I think it's just what we look at. And going back to the shoulder and elbow, the earlier studies that I was talking about, I think it was the resolution of looking at the task and the tasks. In the lab, it's really hard to instrument and quantify things that are, that some people describe as difficult. And so a lot of times the tasks that we do, if you will, are easier than the distinction between the controllers. And I think that's our problem. It's a matter of a combination of resolution and the right tasks. I don't think we're less-handed distally. I think we're probably more-handed.
Okay, thank you.
Richard Nichols.
Great talk, Bob, as usual. I think I missed something along the way, and it's probably my fault, but I'm trying to deal with the issue of the control of interaction torques and the role of these two mechanisms that you're talking about. So I was thinking, probably naively, that if the non-dominant arm, which is good at stabilization, probably takes advantage of a lot of proprioceptive feedback, which is kind of my bias, I guess, and that maybe the control of interaction torques would probably be in the realm of impedance control. And then as you were talking, I tried this little exercise. I shook my hand back and forth and looked at how well I could stabilize my elbow joint, which is kind of analogous to the Judy Smith and Ron Zernike paw shake thing that they do with cats, right? And then I did it with my dominant arm, and I was much better able to control my elbow with my dominant arm than my non-dominant arm. Now, in full disclosure, you're well aware that my dominant arm is my bad arm, right? In your terms. So that may be a confounding factor, but how would you?
No. I don't think so. So I think that what you're dealing with, so the great work by, Gail and Melissa and Ron and Judy on the paw shake demonstrated that for some actions, interaction torques are accommodated into spinal circuits for functional behavior.
Right.
So I totally get that, and I think that that's really cool. And you probably may or may not be. So if you remember the mechanical analysis of their work, the optimal paw shake is one in which the distal accelerations are the highest.
Yes.
So it doesn't, what we think of as coordination kind of goes out the window, and we want this whipping movement. This isn't stabilizing proximally, right? It's helping with the whipping movement. And that doesn't mean that the cat's going to be able to integrate these types of mechanical interactions to specify a movement to throw a rock, right? Because it's got these built-in things, because these things are specifying a particular important task for them that has been built in, in my sense, it's like scratch, Sherrington's scratch reflex, like locomotion, so I think that those tasks that are built in to be fairly automatic, these things can be built into spinal circuits. And then just like every other reflex, when we want to, because when you think of control of interaction force, I agree with Mark that I don't really think that, we have a controller that controls interaction forces. I know you don't either. We have a controller that wants an outcome. And interaction forces are part of the dynamics that's involved with the mechanical system.
Right.
And so sometimes people think, and people talk about this compensating interaction torques. Well, most of the time, like if you say this to Art Quo, who gets really excited about, the passive elements of gait, which are interaction torques, he'd be like, what? Compensate them? Are you freaking crazy? We use them. So, I think that a controller that wants to be efficient sometimes wants to incorporate the mechanical interactions that arise from the body and the environment, and sometimes doesn't. And if we have circuits in the spinal cord that do things like paw shake, I don't know what we have, that will, or locomotion or anything, that will, sort of either dampen or take account of, depending on the circuits, these interactions to accelerate or decelerate the limb, I think that my view is that the higher centers can incorporate those into its plan. The same way that, like, I probably incorporate the ATNR into looking and reaching, those circuits, or as Lundberg showed, I incorporate the flexor withdrawal into walking.
Right, but I wasn't trying to make a distinction between higher centers and the spinal cord, because even in the spinal cord, the CPG and the reflex circuitry have both trajectory control and impedance control all down there in the spinal cord. So I'm trying to figure out. So, for example, if you were to take the patient GL and ask her to do that slicing motion with her two arms, presumably she has some vestige of handedness left. I mean, I'm just wondering if she would be able to regulate, if the interaction torques would be slightly better regulated on her previously dominant arm because of the vestiges of trajectory control that she would have, or whether, I'm trying to see if when you're dealing with high acceleration type movements, I'm trying to get a handle on whether the trajectory control system or the stabilization control system is going to be able to help you out better.
Right. I know, with GL, is everybody freezing, by the way, or is it just at my end?
No, people are not freezing, and you are not freezing.
Wait, I'll turn up the heat. I'll turn up the heat.
I don't mean temperature.
Let's all go to Phoenix.
Wonder if I could react to that. I think that this is what I was trying to get at could play a role here, in that if you think of the impedance side as being something more like yielding, the actuator has its impedance at any moment in time, right? And the spinal cord could be very close to that. But if you think of what characterizes the non-dominant hand, it's this ability of modulating something like an equilibrium point, and that is something like yielding to adapt the impedance to the appropriate point. Then there is an inner conflict with the strategy of the dominant hand, because if you have a good model of interaction torques and you want to use it, you actually have to not yield, because the interaction torques are going to perturb, and you have to not update your plan to yield to that. So the difference might not be that the non-dominant hand doesn't have that plan that compensates for interaction torques. It might be that it yields to the interaction torques because it is specialized in that sort of yielding, if I may use that word, to update its current plan to deal with, to soften its response to perturbations.
Okay, I think Anatol was the next one who raised the hand. So Anatol, unmute yourself and tell us.
Can you?
You're already
I'm unmuted. Do you hear me?
We can hear you.
Yes.
I just wanted to comment about putting study of handedness in some context of because at the level of mechanics, you can describe whatever you want. Okay? Of course, there is symmetry in disturbance, but the major question, I think, why some people left-handed, but the other people right-handed? And I would like to suggest that referent control imply that neurons, motor neurons work in a spatial frame of reference. Let's consider, let's try to, from this point of view, to explain why one guys have left hand dominant and the other right hand. Let's consider frame of reference X, Y, Z. Okay, you know that there are two types of frame of reference. One is left-handed, left frame of reference, and the other right. So, to clarify, if you have X, Y, Z, and you look from Z axis on X and Y, you see in one case the rotation of X, Y axis is counterclockwise, and left frame of reference rotation from X to Y is opposite. So in process of development, the system select frame of reference. Okay, for single joint motion, it doesn't matter. You can take left system coordinate in three-dimensional space or right, and you can walk in this frame of reference. But when you need to also accomplish bilateral movement, okay? And at some point of development, because of body symmetric structure of the body, you need to shoot a single frame of reference for both arms. In this case, it's like a selection between gender, so the system, at certain point, the system selects in what frame of reference the system should produce bilateral movement. And so, and that's why it's very genetically or some occasional environmental conditions, system select one system coordinate or the other. So from here, if you select one system coordinate, say left, you have asymmetry in brain, you have asymmetry in motion. So that's from, and I think the study of handedness should start from definition, from experimental verification in which is the system produced by manual and unilateral movement. That's my comment. So it's a framework which allows you to clarify and advance the research in handedness.